Hey, what's up guys? As you know, Tao's banner is coming soon, so I want to cover a full video on her, on whether or not you should pull for her, and a pretty in-depth look at her strengths and weaknesses, and overall power level as a character. Now, an important disclaimer before I begin, with DPS characters, it's always a question of whether or not you enjoy their playstyle, but their power level also matters, strengths and weaknesses of the character, how good they are in the current endgame content, and what teams you can run with them with supports you may have or plan on getting. So while you should pick the DPS character that you enjoy, I'm going to be looking at a more objective look from like a meta perspective at this character's strengths and weaknesses to help you decide if you should or shouldn't pull for this character. So with that being said, let's get into it. So Tao's a character who my perception on has honestly drastically changed throughout the months of playing her, and she's someone who honestly has a lot of strengths but also a lot of weaknesses that you can or have to play around to get your full potential from this character. And so there's actually a lot of factors that can determine how good of a pull Tao can be for you and how much value, how much potential you can get out of this character. In terms of her strengths, you should know that she's someone who scales pretty well with investment. Once you have good artifacts on her, a good artifact set, good crit, good elemental mastery, you will start dealing a lot of damage. And as a hyper carry, she's someone who you can focus all of your resources into to sort of hyper carry you without needing that well invested supports. Yes, obviously you're going to want like a Xingqiu on your team who also has good artifacts, but Tao is someone who can get a lot of value by just focusing on her as well. Another strength Tao has is obviously her charge attacks, since her charge attacks have a pretty good scaling and especially apply pyro on every single hit, meaning there's no internal cooldown. Every time you charge attack, you're gonna apply pyro and you're gonna vaporize if you pair her with Xingqiu, whose rain swords will apply that hydro. It makes Tao's damage overall quite high, especially against a single enemy when you can spam your charge attacks against them. On top of that, your elemental burst is your sort of AoE damage, having a very high scaling, especially if you are low HP, when paired with your passives as well. Another one of Tao's strengths is actually that she is somewhat flexible with her builds, and this is mainly because yes, first of all, Crimson Witch of Flames is Tao's general best artifact set and what you should go for, but there's many other two pieces that I'll cover in my in-depth Tao guide coming out somewhat soon that you can also go for. Two-piece sets like Crimson Witch, Wanderers, even the four-piece Reminiscence can all be very good alternatives to where you can pick the one that has better substats or that suits your rotation, your playstyle, giving her a bit more flexibility with obviously Crimson Witch of Flames still being what I recommend. For her weaknesses, or at least some downsides that you have to play around and consider, number one, she's a character who gets a lot better with two key upgrades. Now I want to specify, a lot of the time when I talk about Tao, I'm assuming a C0 one, so that my advice is applicable to everyone. That being said, she is someone who gets a lot better with Staff of Homa and her first constellation if you do have them. Now I want to include a sort of disclaimer. I never like recommending people to pull for constellations because I don't want you to spend money or anything when you don't want to. It's not needed. You can run Tao at C0, but her C1 is a very big increase in damage because it makes your charge attacks not cost any stamina. The reason this is so good is because Tao's optimal combos, the way you're going to be playing her is by effectively spamming your charge attacks. When you do this at C0, you're oftentimes going to run out of stamina very quickly, especially if you have to dodge against hard-hitting enemies like the Magukenki or anything in the current abyss that can absolutely one-shot you. Now that being said, there are some ways to play around this. For example, running a Zhongli shield that's very tanky to where you don't really have to dodge enemies as much anymore, especially if your Zhongli is very high level with good artifacts, you won't run out of stamina as much. You can also do some jump canceling, which I'll show on screen now, where you're basically jumping as soon as your charge attack goes out to animation cancel and save you some stamina because you're not like dash canceling. That being said, her C1 is still a massive DPS increase because it does allow you to dash cancel, which is more efficient, and it allows you to dodge enemies between your attacks and just be a lot more comfy. Staff of Homa, on the other hand, will increase your crit damage very significantly, give you a good base attack, and also increase your HP, and also give you more attack based on your max HP. So this is like a weapon that was made for Tao. When people ask me if they should go for Staff of Homa or C1 for Tao, the answer is pretty nuanced. Staff of Homa is better for your account because it's more flexible. You can use it on basically every unit. However, if you do already have a decent 4-star like Deathmatch or Dragon's Bane, I do recommend C1 over Homa for Tao specifically because number one, it's way more comfy and makes Tao a much more fun character. Like personally, I'm pulling for C1 because running out of stamina is very annoying, but also in practice, it's a higher DPS increase because it allows you to dash cancel and dodge enemies. Now moving on to another downside I can mention is that she does depend on Xingqiu quite heavily. To get an optimal Tao team, compared to literally any other character you can pair with Tao, she will get so much more value if you pair her with Xingqiu. Xingqiu is a high value support that many teams, many pyro carries, electro carries, and just teams in general really depend on. That being said, if you do have Xingqiu available, if you can use Tao with him, then she becomes a lot more valuable to pull for and a lot more recommendable. Since for the Spiral Abyss you need two teams, I would mainly recommend pulling for Tao if you can make a team with her and have a second team that doesn't need Xingqiu. A good example of this is, let's just make a generic Tao team. If your second half is like a Shoutout team that doesn't need any of these characters, Tao can be very beneficial to use. Also, I believe it's worth mentioning that Hu Tao doesn't actually need Bennett or really want Bennett at all. While Bennett's such a broken unit that he can be used in any team, there's so many teams that depend on him, especially like Xiangling comps or other hyper carries that really want that attack percent that Bennett gives you. Because of that, having Hu Tao on your other team will allow you to very easily put Bennett in your second one, which I believe is one of Hu Tao's biggest strengths. In fact, Hu Tao's flexibility in her teams after the Xingqiu slot is actually very nice since there are many different combos of supports that aren't that high priority that you can run with Hu Tao. A team that runs double cryo like Kaya and Diona can help you freeze and give you a shield with Diona's elemental skill. You can also run a double Geo comp with Zhongli and Albedo, and even pairing Xingqiu with Fischl to electrocharge enemies and then also get the Vaporize can be very nice, especially against heavy enemies that won't get knocked back by overload. Hu Tao's teams are therefore a bit more flexible than you might think. However, I do typically recommend Xingqiu with her, basically no matter what, because the damage increase is absolutely huge. I know there are some mono pyro teams that work though, but they're definitely not my favorite and not as good as the other teams that I mentioned in my opinion. I do lastly want to specify though that Hu Tao, especially at C0, is someone who really wants or at least benefits from a shield greatly, because not only do you not have to run a healer with like this core comp, because Xingqiu and Hu Tao will heal you a bit, but also without her first constellation, Hu Tao is going to spend a lot of stamina dash attacking, to where if you spend more stamina dodging and running around, mainly dashing to avoid attacks, you'll have a lot less stamina for your optimal charge attack combos, to where having a shield can help you tank that damage and save some stamina. Now let's say you want to run Xiangling in your other team. Xiangling is a character who also uses Xingqiu a lot, but when you think about it, Xiangling actually has a ton of amazing team comps that don't even need Xingqiu at all. If you have Child, for example, who's on the current banner, Hu Tao becomes an even better pull because your Xiangling, who's a free pyro carry, can use Child if you want to use both of these pyro carries together. You can even make a reverse melt quick swap team, which I've covered in other videos. That is another example team of Xiangling not needing Xingqiu, to where Hu Tao isn't really stealing your Xiangling's support. The reason I'm using Xiangling as an example here, and the reason why Hu Tao is often compared to Xiangling, is because Xiangling, once again, is also a pyro polearm, but is also free to play, and so everyone has this character. The main thing I want to say is Xiangling, especially with her fourth constellation, will obviously give you more area of effect damage, more AoE, notably in like a Child team who also gives you AoE, making her shine more against multiple enemies. Hu Tao will, however, deal a lot more single target damage, making her shine exceptionally well against bosses like the Magu Kenki or the mechanical array that was in the last Abyss. So Hu Tao's full value, full potential really depends on what you're fighting, on what the endgame content is, and what the Abyss rotation actually ends up being. And while her single target damage is a lot higher than her AoE, I do want to mention that she can deal a decent amount of AoE against specific enemies. What I mean by that is if you can charge attack through the enemy, if they're not too massive and you can actually charge attack through multiple, you will be dealing more AoE damage. Although do keep in mind you'll only vaporize your first charge attack typically. And yes, you also have your burst that does a pretty good amount of AoE, although typically it'll still be less damage than like a Xiangling team against multiple enemies. And so from a meta perspective, in a pretty unbiased look at C0 Hu Tao. Now again, she gets better with C1 and Homa, but especially at C0, against multiple enemies, I wouldn't recommend using Hu Tao over like a good Xiangling team or even other AoE DPSs like Ganyu that can consistently freeze literally everything. I personally have 9-star cleared every single Abyss with my C0 Hu Tao, even the ones that are the most AoE, so it's not like she's incapable of doing it. It will just require a bit more investment and more effort against a lot of enemies than someone like Xiangling, whereas single target, she will obviously exceed her. So with all that being said, should you pull for Hu Tao? Well, as I said, that does depend on you and if you enjoy her playstyle. I do also believe her value in pulling increases significantly based on other characters you have. For example, if you have Child and can already make a good like Child Xiangling team for AoE and have your Xingqiu free for your Hu Tao, she will increase in value. Same thing can be said with Staff of Homa and your first constellation. And she also has the strength of being a hyper carry who you can mainly focus your investment onto to get a lot of value without needing to build too many characters. To avoid overhyping her though, I do want to make it clear that I don't rank her as highly as AoE DPSs, at least for the current Abyss. Also, you should know that Toma will be on her banner, so that can be another incentive to pull for her if you do want Toma on your account. For more information on her team, synergies, builds, and all that, I will be releasing an updated Hu Tao guide in a few days, so be sure to subscribe for that if you aren't already. And while I can't answer the question of whether or not you should spend your own personal primo gems on her, my goal in this video is to give you guys all of her strengths and all of her weaknesses, and also talk about her important power spikes like C1 and Homa that can change the value of the character if you do decide or not to go for those. And so overall, Hu Tao is a strong DPS, but definitely not a must pull. With that being said, I hope this video was helpful. Honestly, there was a lot to cover and I hope I wasn't too confusing because I sometimes get overwhelmed when there's like too much to talk about. I want to say everything, so being structured is kind of hard for me, but I hope I did a good job and did a pretty good explanation of Hu Tao's strengths and weaknesses. But yeah, that's about it. I want to keep this video somewhat short. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.